It's one of the most famous skyjackings in history, perpetrated by a mystery man known only as Dan Cooper or D.B. Cooper. But how did he pull off this audacious crime, and what might have happened to him after he jumped from a Boeing 727 mid-flight under cover of darkness and with a huge ransom strapped to his body? This is History Calling, where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past, and today I'm using the original FBI files, among other sources, to look at the mystery of D.B. Cooper. Our story starts at Portland International Airport, Oregon, on the 24th of November, 1971. At about 2 p.m., a perfectly ordinary-looking man walked up to the counter of Northwest Orient Airlines and, having given the name Dan Cooper, calmly paid cash with a $20 bill for a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington. He was booked on Flight 305. In those days, there was little to no airport security, and so no one checked what he was carrying in the cheap black attaché case he took on board the plane with him. He was later described as a white male, aged in his 40s, though some said he could have been as little as 38 or as much as 50, and about 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet in height, but bear in mind that the flight attendant who made this guess usually saw him in a sitting position. He was 180 to 190 pounds in weight with a medium build. He had a medium to dark complexion, which was smooth. One flight attendant thought he looked Latin, while a female passenger who saw him thought he might be Mexican-American. His hair was dark brown, straight and flat, with narrow sideburns to his mid-ear, and he wore dark-rimmed wraparound sunglasses which obscured his eyes and eyebrows. He had on a dark brown suit, possibly with a thin black stripe, a white shirt, brown socks, and brown ankle-length pebble green shoes, which were not tie-tight shoes. He wore a dark raincoat or topcoat. A black tie with a circular, gold-rimmed pearl tie pin was later found on the plane, and also thought very likely to be his. Other witnesses said his suit was black, and to me at least that would make more sense with a black tie. He had a low voice, but his accent was unremarkable to the flight attendant who spoke to him the most, though she guessed maybe West or Midwest, which would suggest that he had what we in the UK would call a standard American accent, meaning it's not particularly distinctive in the way that a Southern or New York accent might be. It's also been suggested that he could have been Canadian, as the Canadian accent is so similar to some American accents, and he supposedly used the phrase negotiable American currency at one point, perhaps indicating a foreigner. In 2009, the FBI even speculated that the name Dan Cooper may have been drawn from a Franco-Belgian comic book which was only published in French at the time. This, they thought, might support the idea of a bilingual Canadian or an American ex-military man who had spent time in Europe. On the other hand, it might just be a coincidence. The plane was a Boeing 727, and it had an unusual design feature which would be of crucial importance later on. It had an aft staircase which was accessible from the passenger cabin and used for embarking and disembarking. After boarding, Cooper sat down in seat 18E at the back of the plane. He ordered a bourbon and 7-Up, which he paid for with a $20 bill, and the aircraft took off at 2:53 p.m. for what should have been a 36-minute journey. Again, let's all marvel at the idea that in 1971 you could walk into an airport with no prior booking at 2 o'clock and be in the air 53 minutes later. That wouldn't even be enough to clear security nowadays. There were 42 people on board Flight 305, 35 regular passengers, 3 female flight attendants, a 3-man flight crew, and Cooper. Just as the plane taxied for takeoff, Cooper passed a note to an attendant named Florence Schaffner, which she assumed was his phone number, and so she dropped it into her handbag without reading it. Cooper leaned in and told her that she'd better look at it, as he had a bomb. Unfolding the note, Schaffner found a piece of white, unlined paper with just a few words written in neat black felt-tip pen, and which said something to the effect of, "Miss, I am hijacking this plane. I have a bomb. Sit next to me." She asked him if he was joking, and he responded, "No, miss, this is for real." Shaken by what was happening, Schaffner did as she was told, and although the witness statements I read conflicted on this point, it seems that she got a brief look at the bomb in the briefcase. Her fellow flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, observed what was happening and thought it was strange that Schaffner was moving around like this during takeoff, but didn't yet know what she was seeing. Schaffner either dropped the note and it was picked up by Mucklow, or Schaffner handed it to Mucklow. Again, sources conflict, but either way, the latter ended up reading it. She then lifted the phone next to her and called the cockpit to alert them to what was happening and tell them it was not a joke. Schaffner was now having the hijacker's demands dictated to her as she wrote them down on either an envelope or a notepad. Yet again, we have different accounts here from different witness statements, and as you're probably already sensing, that happens a lot when you read the records for this case. I think this is partly because people's memories often trick them, and the cabin and flight crew were under enormous stress that night. But also, as far as I can tell, the statements were not recorded on a tape recorder or a camera, but rather just summarised as they were made, and so the FBI agents recording them may have misunderstood the witnesses as well. We don't have transcripts of what was actually said. I do wish that investigators at the time had double-checked and compared these statements, or rather summaries of interviews, more thoroughly, kept better records of them, and gone back to ask for further clarification regarding the conflicts within them, but these problems can't be fixed now. The man calling himself Dan Cooper demanded $200,000 in circulated US currency to be delivered in a knapsack. Remember, though, that another source said he used the phrase negotiable American currency. He also wanted 2 back and 2 front parachutes, and for the plane to be refuelled upon arrival at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, known as SeaTac for short. The deadline, he said, was 5 p.m, and all passengers were to be kept on the plane while refuelling occurred. As she finished writing the new note, he told her he expected no fuss and no funny stuff or I'll do the job. Schaffner took the 2 notes to the cockpit to show the captain, and Mucklow took the seat next to the hijacker. She would remain with him for almost the entirety of the rest of the hijacking. Cooper now opened the attaché case and showed Mucklow, and I quote a later report by the FBI, a device with 8 red cylinders and a wire running from the cylinders towards a large 6 by 8 by 2 inch diameter battery. The wire had a red plastic coating around it, all with the exception of the last inch, which was bare, and which the man held in between his fingers. He told her it was an electronic device and suggested the aircraft radio be used as little as possible. He said he didn't think radio transmissions would bother it, but wanted to let the crew know. Mucklow thought she was looking at dynamite, but readily admitted afterwards that she wasn't familiar with dynamite, so this was just her initial impression. She called the cockpit to pass along this information. They were right at the back of the plane, remember, next to the phone, and continued sitting with Cooper. The information was relayed to the ground, and an operation began to get together the items demanded. The money was obtained from Seattle First National Bank, which had a large stash of money in its vault with the serial numbers already logged on microfilm, and the parachutes came from a nearby skydiving school. As the flight progressed, Mucklow and Cooper made small talk. He declined to say where he was from, but when Mucklow told him she was living in Minneapolis, he said that was a nice place, suggesting a familiarity with it. He also told her, when she asked why he'd chosen that flight to hijack, that it's not because I have a grudge against your airlines, it's just because I have a grudge. This flight had simply suited his time, place, and plans. He also repeatedly told her that he wanted nothing funny, and no funny stuff from her or the crew. Other conversation and activity revealed that he was a smoker. Indeed, he smoked many cigarettes during the flight, using a brand of matches called Sky Chef to light them, or had Mucklow light them for him. As regards his demeanour, she said that he seemed very polite, like an executive, and that he knew a considerable amount about how the aircraft would need to be refuelled, and about aviation more generally. He was also clearly familiar with the area they were traversing, for as they circled over Tacoma, he looked out the window and correctly ascertained their location, despite no outside source having told him where they were. The rest of the passengers were unaware of what was happening, and Cooper became a little antsy when one unsuspecting man got up during the flight and came to the back of the plane looking for a magazine to pass the time with. Mucklow helped him find one and he returned to his seat. Cooper was concerned that the man was an air marshal and had to be reassured by her that that was not the case and that there were no marshals on board. He then told her to tell the captain that the other passengers were not to be told what was happening, and had his note, the note Florence Schaffner had written, and the matchbook cover he'd been using to light his cigarettes returned to him. I'd like to point out, though, that this detail comes from an interview with Mucklow on the 3rd of December 1971 in the FBI files, while the report of her initial statement, taken on the night of the incident, said that he did this later while they were on the ground at Seattle. Whenever the gathering up of the evidence happened, Cooper was apparently covering his tracks, collecting anything that had his fingerprints or handwriting on it. This was before DNA testing, of course, and that led him to leave some evidence behind which he wouldn't have realised the value of, but we'll come back to that a little later. By the by, I don't know what became of the $20 bill he used to buy his drink, but the $20 bill he bought the plane ticket with was mingled in with other money at the check-in desk and couldn't be picked out later on. At 5:15 p.m, Cooper complained about the delay, as he'd wanted to be done with this phase of his hijacking by 5 o'clock. Mucklow called the cockpit for an update and was told that they were still waiting for the front parachutes to arrive from McCord Air Force Base. This wasn't true, as they were coming from a skydiving school. Cooper responded to this by again showing considerable knowledge of the local area in his comment that McCord is only 20 minutes from Tacoma. It doesn't take that long. Mucklow again called the cockpit, and the pilot asked for permission to begin their descent without the parachutes having arrived yet. Cooper agreed, as long as they would be there by the time refuelling was done. As it happened, the chutes were there before the plane landed. Flight 305 touched down at SeaTac at 5:46 p.m, the passengers having been told that the delay was due to minor mechanical difficulties. With Cooper's permission, it was parked away from the terminal on a disused, low-lit runway. Mucklow had also been allowed to move 5 passengers away from Cooper's immediate vicinity while they taxied. He went to the toilet, taking the case with him. Then, having returned, and as refuelling began, Mucklow was allowed to go outside to collect the money. It was in a canvas bag, not a knapsack, was all in $20 bills, and weighed 19 pounds. When she returned, Cooper inspected the money, said it looked okay, and agreed to allow the passengers to disembark, which they did, still with no idea that they'd just survived a hijacking. In an effort to lighten the mood, Mucklow jokingly asked if she could have some of the money, and Cooper agreed, handing her a packet. She then explained that she couldn't actually take it, citing a company policy which forbade flight attendants accepting gratuities. Mucklow then had to make 3 additional trips to bring the parachutes on board, with Cooper assuring her that they weren't heavy and that she would be able to manage. At one point, while she was outside, Schaffner reported that she and the other flight attendant, Alice Hancock, conversed a little with Cooper, who allowed Schaffner to feel how heavy the money bag was and offered to tip them with the change he had from the drink he'd ordered at the start of the trip. Like Mucklow, though, they declined, citing their company's policy against gratuities. I find it interesting that Cooper did this, considering his other efforts to gather up anything he had touched. The notes would have had his fingerprints on them, and it seems like he made a slip-up here, and it was simply fortuitous for him that none of the women took the money. When Mucklow reboarded, he had her draw down the window shades in his area of the plane, and when she gave him an instruction sheet about how to use the chutes, he told her he didn't need it, suggesting parachute experience. Now, the difference between back and front chutes, if I understand them correctly, and I'm sure someone in the comments will let me know if this is wrong, is that back chutes are main chutes, while those you put on your front are intended to be reserve chutes. Ideally, your back chute has D-rings on it that you can attach the front chutes to, but it emerged later that the back parachutes provided to Cooper did not. Upon returning with the final chute, Mucklow observed that Cooper had opened up one of the others and was cutting its pink nylon cords and using them to secure the canvas bag full of money, complaining that it should have arrived in a knapsack. She also noticed at this point that he had a small green paper bag, the only other luggage she saw with him apart from his briefcase. With the plane refueled and the money and chutes on board, Cooper gave Mucklow further instructions which she wrote down on one of her pay sheets. They were to head to Mexico City, or indeed any place in Mexico. The plane was to fly no higher than 10,000 feet, with the gear down and the flaps down. One report from Mucklow said the flaps had to be at 15, and this is supported by the records of the communications between the plane and ground control. All the cabin lights were to be kept out, and while he didn't mind them refuelling in Mexico, they were not to refuel in the United States. The remaining crew were to stay forward of the first-class curtain. He also wanted to fly with the rear door open and the aft staircase extended. This plan wouldn't work though. The plane couldn't take off with the door open and the staircase deployed, nor could the staircase be opened from the cockpit. It had to be done manually. Furthermore, the flight conditions specified meant that they would have to refuel in the States. Cooper, who was getting anxious about the amount of time they'd been on the ground, which had occurred due to complications with refuelling when the first truck sent ran out of fuel, therefore agreed that the door and staircase could be closed, and that they could make a pit stop for refuelling. After mulling over a few options, including Phoenix, Arizona, Reno, Nevada was agreed upon. At the same time, he gave the other two flight attendants, Florence Schaffner and Alice Hancock, permission to leave, telling one, when she asked if she could get her handbag out of the cupboard near him, that he wouldn't bite her. He kept as his hostages Mucklow, who he now needed to help him get the staircase down, and the three-man flight crew, pilot, co-pilot and engineer. When Tina Mucklow told him they would be taking off as soon as they filed a flight plan, he responded, "Never mind, they can do that over the radio once we get up. Let's get the show on the road." The pilot therefore decided, apparently without telling Cooper, that they would fly along a flight path known as Victor 23. The initial plan was to have Mucklow lower the staircase once they were in the air, and there was some discussion about what rope she could use to secure herself while she was undertaking this dangerous manoeuvre. But Cooper soon told her never mind, as he would do it himself, and had her show him how to operate the stairs. As they began taxiing down the runway with the rear door not completely shut but apparently locked in a slightly open position, Mucklow later reported holding her ears because of the resulting noise from the engines, she told him that they had oxygen on board, and he responded, "Yes, I know where it is. If I need it, I will get it." Again suggesting some level of familiarity with airplanes, though really he could have just inquired about that information during a previous flight. The aircraft took off again at 7:36 p.m, and around 5 minutes later, Cooper sent Mucklow to the cockpit, telling her to close the first-class curtains on her way and that no one was to disturb him again. She did as she was told and later said that the last time she saw him, he had a nylon cord tied around his waist and was standing in the aisle. Before she finished securing the curtain, she pleaded with him to take the bomb with him, and he said he would take it with him or disarm it before he leaves. All the hostages were now in the cockpit, and soon after, Mucklow's statement says 10 minutes, the air traffic controller's records say only 1, Cooper phoned them on the internal phone to say that he couldn't get the rear staircase down. The pilot agreed to level off and slow down the plane, and at 7:43 p.m, according to the air traffic controller records, a red indicator light on the second officer's panel showed that the stairs had been lowered. Cooper spoke to the cockpit once more at 8:05 p.m. to confirm he needed no further assistance, then no more was heard from him. At 8:10 p.m. by the air traffic controller records, and I quote, "Crew reported oscillation of cabin rate of climb indicator. This is probably due to HJ, hijackers, weight now on stairs. Stairs extending further, resultant effect on cabin pressure. May be best estimate of when he exited the plane." These same records also state that at this time the plane was at 10,000 feet and travelling at 170 knots. The outdoor temperature was -7 degrees Celsius. A redacted and therefore partially anonymised interview with one of the pilots confirms that the change in cabin pressure and the vibration it caused, which has since become known as the pressure bump, happened within 5 or 10 minutes of the last verbal communication with Cooper. Witnesses on the ground who had seen the low-flying jet later described the weather that night as misting rain. The plane flew on and landed safely at Reno at 11:05 p.m, despite having the aft staircase down. It was carefully monitored as it landed to make sure Cooper didn't jump out onto the runway, and no one was seen exiting the plane during landing or taxiing. The crew and Mucklow now cautiously looked into the passenger cabin. Cooper was gone, and after a search, it was found that the briefcase, supposedly containing a bomb, was also missing. Soon after, it was noted that a plastic placard, which had been next to the rear door and which gave details about how to use its handle, was also gone. More on that in a few minutes. Some things had been left behind though. 2 of the chutes, including the one Cooper had earlier cut open, were still there. So too was the black clip-on tie, assumed to be his, with its mother-of-pearl pin and 8 cigarette butts. 2 hairs were also recovered from his seat. The plane was dusted for prints and many latents were taken, some FBI files say as many as 70, but they were not felt to be of good quality and have never been matched to anyone. Let's look at the objects recovered in more detail. As I've explained, Cooper wanted 2 chest chutes and 2 back chutes, and that's what was provided. There was concern on the ground that he meant to parachute out with 1 or more hostages, so the chutes were not deliberately tampered with. However, due to the speed at which they had to be acquired, one of the chest chutes was, purely by accident, a dummy chute, intended only for training purposes. Cooper either didn't know it was a dummy or didn't care, because he actually took that chute with him, perhaps to wrap the money in once he realised it hadn't been delivered in a knapsack. As I've said, it had no D-rings on it to fasten it to the back chute though, and I think this is why Mucklow saw him with nylon cord around his waist, because that was the only way to secure the money to his body. I don't know why he asked for front chutes at all, unless it was to throw investigators off and make them think he intended to take a hostage with him. Surely he intended to wear a back chute and have the knapsack on his front, precluding the use of a reserve on his chest. I suppose he could have intended to have a front chute and tie the knapsack around him in such a way that it dangled below him as he fell, but that would be very awkward, and remember that the money weighed 19 pounds. Anyway, the dummy front chute and the money went with him, while the white back chute with sage green nylon strings, which he must have used to jump, was operable, but it couldn't be steered or made to slow down the rate of descent. The man who packed the chutes up, Earl Cossey, later said he thought that a night jump with the inappropriate footwear that Cooper was wearing, no ability to pick a landing spot, slow down or see the ground coming up on one, was likely to result in a hard impact and leg and ankle injuries, and I agree. Even if he miraculously landed on flattish terrain, Cooper was also weighed down by the cash he presumably had strapped to his front, making his touchdown even rougher, and he could well have collided with a tree or a rock face. Next up, we have the tie. It had a label which said Towncraft and indicated it came from a JCPenney shop. It was determined to be at least a year or a year and a half old, and although it's not certain that it came from him, it was found on his seat and seems highly unlikely to have originated with anyone else. It was tested for DNA in 2000 to 2001 and produced 2 small samples and 1 large, but they have never been matched to anyone, and we cannot even prove that they come from the hijacker. The tie may have been worn by other people before it came into Cooper's possession, or been contaminated in the decades between its recovery and its testing. I think it would be interesting, though, if it hasn't already been done, to put the DNA eventually recovered from it through the increasingly large commercial databases held by companies like Ancestry and see if anything pops up. In the late noughties and early 2010s, a team of so-called citizen sleuths were given access to the FBI files and remaining physical evidence from the case, and conducted a fresh analysis of it. Their testing of the tie revealed particles consistent with match heads, indicating the wearer was a smoker, which we know Cooper was. It also had particles of unusual metals on it, like titanium and bismuth, which they posited suggested that Cooper worked in a facility that used these elements and wore his tie to work, possibly indicating that he was a manager or engineer. Regarding his clothing more generally, his garments were a strange choice for someone intending to jump from a plane at 10,000 feet at night in sub-zero November temperatures in the rain. He was in no way properly dressed for this action, even if it had taken place during daylight hours. 7 of the cigarette butts were determined by the FBI to be filter tips from the brand Raleigh, and the 8th was likely the same. Had this skyjacking taken place 15 or 20 years later, Cooper would have been much more likely to remove this evidence to prevent his DNA being collected, but as this was 1971, he left them. Unfortunately, when they were sent for in 1998 for such DNA tests to be attempted, they were found to have been destroyed years earlier in Las Vegas, which just makes me want to scream, as they were probably the best lead left in the case. Even more frustratingly, this wasn't the only bungled handling of the scant physical evidence available. Of the 2 hairs recovered, one was a limb hair lifted from the seat, the other was a head hair taken from the headrest. The limb hair, according to a contemporary FBI report, quote, possesses too few unique microscopic characteristics to be of value for this purpose, meaning comparison to another sample. It was subsequently destroyed in yet another instance of very sloppy, not to mention short-sighted, investigative work. Just because the technology of 1971 couldn't do much with the hair didn't mean that it wouldn't have been useful in the future. As if that wasn't bad enough, when the FBI went looking for the head hair to run DNA analysis on it in 2002, they discovered that it was lost somewhere between Los Angeles and Las Vegas in 1974. So while the more than 40,000 pages in the FBI files are bulging with what looks like every useless letter to the Bureau written by fantasists and liars, either pretending to be Cooper or saying that they knew him, the most crucial pieces of evidence, the cigarettes and the hair, were either willfully destroyed or lost by the very people tasked with finding him. All I can say is that no current FBI agents are to blame for this, and I would like to think that procedures and chains of evidence have been massively tightened up since the 70s. A huge aerial and ground search was undertaken in Oregon by police, sheriff's officers, and FBI agents in an effort to trace Cooper, but the terrain in the Cascade Mountains was rough and the search teams were beset by rain and fog. No trace of the hijacker, the parachutes, or the money was found. An error by one of the first reporters to cover the case in Oregon led to his pseudonym being changed from Dan Cooper to D.B. Cooper, possibly because a D.B. Cooper was interviewed and quickly ruled out as a suspect by the FBI. This was soon picked up on by other news outlets, as you can see here, and has become a common way to refer to him. The serial numbers of the banknotes were released to the public, along with the images of Cooper I've been showing you in this video, which were compiled based on witness statements from those who interacted with him. The FBI contacted parachuting organizations to try to find out if one of their members might be Cooper, and investigated many hundreds of suspects during the next few years. But the money didn't show up in circulation, all leads led to dead ends, and no further evidence was found in the days, weeks, and even years after the incident. It seemed like that was the end of it, although Cooper was indicted by the U.S. District Court for the state of Oregon in 1976 for air piracy and extortion. As it transpired, though, this strange case still had a couple of twists left in it. Before I reveal what they were, though, if you're enjoying this content and getting value from it, please hit the subscribe button under the video and switch on the notification bell so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. You can also find me on Patreon, where I share perks like early access to ad-free videos and mini podcasts. I have an Amazon storefront too, where I share lots of history-themed recommendations for books and other items. Both are linked in the description box below, along with my Instagram page. And now, let's find out what the final twists in the Cooper skyjacking case were, the second of which turned out to be a bizarre little mystery all of its own. In November 1978, the placard from the rear door of the plane, which I mentioned earlier, was found near Toutle in Washington, having apparently become detached after Cooper opened the staircase. The location it showed up in matches with a flight plan created by the FBI, although it has no provenance anymore and it's been the subject of considerable debate regarding its accuracy. This is despite the fact that the plane was being tracked on both military and civilian radar, and there is mention in the FBI files of that data being used to reconstruct its exact path. Sadly, like the hair and cigarettes, that important data is now lost. 15 months after the placard showed up, in February 1980, came the most significant discovery since 1971. An 8-year-old boy called Brian Ingram was digging in the sand at a beach known as Tina Bar, north of Portland and on the Columbia River, when he discovered 3 bundles which turned out to be $5,800 of the Cooper ransom money. The banknotes were still in their original rubber bands and were badly degraded. The beach was searched further, but nothing else was found, and theories have abounded as to how the bundles made their way there. The major problem is that Tina Bar is 20 miles away from where Cooper is thought to have jumped from the plane, and its location conflicts with the flight path in the FBI files and the spot where the placard was found. So although one theory about how the money got to the beach is that the plane flew over it and that's where the hijacker jumped out, other evidence doesn't support this conclusion. A second idea is that Cooper survived the jump and buried the bundles there, having either landed nearby, which would mean that the FBI flight plan is wrong, or gone there at a later date. If he buried them, though, it was a strange place to do it, in shallow, wet sand and not in a sealed, durable container that would protect his precious loot from rotting away. Likewise, if someone else discovered the money and took it to Tina Bar, then they too made little effort to protect it from the elements. A third theory is that the bundles were swept there by one of the Columbia River's tributaries whilst still in the original bag Cooper had jumped with. In this scenario, the bag kept the bundles together until it eventually rotted away before them. In 1980, this appeared to be supported by a study of Tina Bar carried out by a geologist called Dr. Leonard Palmer at the behest of the FBI. According to the Citizen Sleuth's website, however, in between the 1971 hijacking and the 1980 money find, the Columbia River was dredged and sand was deposited on Tina Bar in 1974. Palmer's report determined that the money was in a layer of top sand laid down by the dredging. This implied that the money was somewhere else upstream for years before coming to rest on Tina Bar. At first glance, this seemed to provide an answer as to how the bundles got there. They landed somewhere else and were eventually washed downstream in the Washougal River until they came to rest at Tina Bar sometime after the 1974 dredging operation and before their 1980 discovery. The Citizen Sleuth team soon discovered problems with Palmer's theory, though, especially his assessment of when the different layers of clay and mud had come to be on Tina Bar. The rubber bands holding the money together were still there when Brian Ingram discovered them, though they crumbled to the touch, and having conducted experiments on similar bands, the team determined that their condition suggested that the money had been buried in the sands within a year of the hijacking, so by November 1972 at the latest. Had they been floating around for longer, the bands would have disintegrated. At the same time, the team felt it was unlikely that the bundles were there in 1974 and had stayed so much intact through a dredging and bulldozing operation. There is therefore no satisfactory explanation for the bundles making their way there through natural means, and as I've already discussed, there were serious problems with the theory that Cooper landed nearby or buried them there later. As with so much else about this case, the rediscovered money raised more questions than it answered. So what are my thoughts on this entire story? Well, for a start, I don't think Cooper was anywhere near as smart as some people have made out. He showed some knowledge of planes, but in other areas there were serious gaps in his understanding, which suggests to me at least that he wasn't actually very au fait with them. He didn't know how the aft staircase worked, for instance, even though it was crucial to his plan, or that the demands he made about how the plane should be configured during the second part of its flight would make a non-stop trip to Mexico impossible. Of course, he may always have intended to parachute out long before that, so knew it didn't really matter if they made it to Mexico or not, but making the demand led to discussions over the new route they would take to Reno, and the result was that he can't really have known where he was when he jumped, as the plane was no longer taking a specific flight path cleared by him or which he could have anticipated in advance. Had he always planned to jump out over Oregon, why not just choose a destination within the States rather than ever bothering with the Mexico idea? In the end, while I think he knew he'd be jumping over land, excluding any lakes or rivers he might have ended up in, and he might have looked for ground lights before he exited the plane, He can't have known exactly where he was jumping, and I'm curious as to what his plan was when he landed on the ground, likely injured, with a massive parachute full of very heavy cash. Where was he going to go, and how was he going to get there? Was he seriously just hoping he'd be near a road and could hitchhike, with the whole country looking for him? The whole thing just looks chaotic and very poorly planned. I really don't see any criminal mastermind behind this, and I don't understand why other people do. Furthermore, I looked up sunset times for Seattle on the 24th of November, and the time I got was 4:24 p.m. Cooper had set a deadline for taking off from SeaTac again at 5 p.m, meaning that even if this deadline had been met, which it wasn't, they weren't in the air until 7:36 p.m, it would still have been dark when he made the jump. We therefore can't even say that he originally planned to do this in daylight so that he could see where he'd been landing. I understand the argument that he didn't want people to see him floating down to Earth, and in fact the flight was being followed by military planes whose pilots may well have seen him had it been daylight, but a night jump was insanely risky. Would a better plan not have been to bring his own parachute that could be manoeuvred and to take a very early morning summer flight in better weather when most people would still have been in bed, then also jumped out over deserted land in an area he was familiar with, perhaps with a car somewhere nearby that he could make a getaway in? It's still not perfect, but I think his chances of survival would have been much higher. His actual plan was such a mess that I wondered if his aviation knowledge was just book knowledge, with little to no practical experience. Yes, it was enough to impress Tina Mucklow, but although she was a flight attendant, she was still only 22 years old and not a pilot herself. Had he been sitting next to an expert, they might have had a different assessment of his understanding. Furthermore, his business suit clothing was ridiculous for the jump he undertook, and for the area he was jumping into, and for the weather conditions he'd be exposed to. His other actions don't suggest any superior intelligence or great forward planning either. It's true that he gathered up some evidence, but this was done quite haphazardly, with other items being left behind. He even offered money to the flight attendants, which would have had his fingerprints on it. Why didn't he just wear gloves? Had he done that, he could have sidestepped that whole problem. His method of getting the money and parachutes on board was stupid too. This happened in America. He's lucky that Tina Mucklow wasn't given a weapon when she came off the plane to collect the items for him and told to take him out upon reboarding. I think people are so distracted by the crazy nature of this hijacking and by the fact that Cooper was never found that they often overlook how sloppy the organisation and execution of this whole thing really was. As for Cooper's fate, I think that whether his chute opened or not, he probably went splat somewhere in Oregon, having perhaps hit a tree, a mountain, or perhaps a tree on a mountain, then decomposed and or been eaten by animals. If he hit the ground very hard, there wouldn't have even been a body per se to find. He'd have basically disintegrated. The fact that some of the money was found years later and that none of the rest of it ever surfaced, despite the serial numbers being released to the public and numerous rewards being offered to the first person to present even just one of the missing banknotes, indicates to me that it was never spent and that Cooper died on the night of the 24th of November 1971. Of course, plenty of people think he survived. No human remains were found and no one was ever reported missing who could be matched to him. As a result, hundreds upon hundreds of suspects have been looked at by the FBI, over 800 within the first 5 years of the investigation in fact, but none have ever been shown to be him. In July 2016, the Bureau announced that it had redirected resources allocated to the D.B. Cooper case in order to focus on other investigative priorities and would no longer actively investigate this case. Even assuming he didn't die in the jump, Cooper is likely deceased by now, even if he was at the lower end of the age range given for him in 1971, and it seems incredibly unlikely that the case will ever be solved. Nevertheless, it's one of my favourite historical mysteries, in part because of how outlandish the crime was, and in part because, with the possible exception of a hijacker, no one died or was seriously injured, though I don't think we should discount the mental trauma that the flight and cabin crew were put through during the incident. As always though, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think Cooper survived, and do you have any theories about how the money got to Tina Barr? Let me know in the comments below, and for more aviation history and crazy mysteries, try one of these videos next. Until next time all, keep learning.